come to track 5, fostering dialogue for interregional cooperation, Australasia and India. In this track, first, we will also be officially inaugurating the Symbiosis Center for India-Australia Studies. India and Australia share many commonalities. Both are members of the Commonwealth of Nations. They share political, economic, security, and sporting ties, especially cricket. Foreign diplomatic relations between the two countries are very well established. And recently, we all are aware, this bilateral relationship has been further elevated. And higher education cannot be ignored, as it is a key sector holding great potential. Recently, the two countries have agreed to set up a task force to establish a framework for the mutual recognition of qualifications. At Symbiosis, we believe there could be no better time to launch this center. And we're deeply honored to have Mr. Peter Truswell, the Consul General of Australia in Mumbai, who has consented to be also the keynote speaker. At this point, I would also like to thank Dr. Monica Kennedy, Senior Trade and Investment Commissioner, Minister, Councillor Commercial, South Asia, and her office for their continuous support for this initiative. With these words, I would like to invite Dr. Vidya Rodekar, the Pro-Chancellor of Symbiosis, to give her opening remarks and her vision for this center. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Swati. My dear friend and the Consul General of Australia to India, Mr. Peter Truswell. My other friends from Australia, Ravneet, Elizabeth, Wingard, and others. My colleagues here at the university, Dr. Rajni Gupte, the Vice Chancellor, the Dean of Academics, Dr. Bhama, Dr. Anita Patankar. So today is a historic moment in the life of Symbiosis and this university, because we are launching the Symbiosis Center for India-Australia Studies. It's been long since Symbiosis as a university has been having relationships with Australian universities. And there are several universities in Australia that we work very closely with. I would like to take some of the names, of course, Deakin, Macquarie, University of Queensland, Edith Cowan University, University of Adelaide, Bond University, Swinburne University of Technology, and more recently, we've just started our dialogues with Melbourne University as well. And over the past many years, we've seen a lot of exchange of faculty members back and forth from these universities doing joint research amongst, a good amount of research that has been happening between these universities and our university. And of course, mobility of students, which of course is one-way traffic, I would say. We don't see as many Australian students coming here as much as Indian students wanting to go to Australia, either on a pathway program or for a semester abroad, or most of the times, on a full-time degree program in Australia. And there are several reasons to this, and we felt that probably we are not giving as much exposure to both the Indian and the Australian students, and that's what we felt that we should establish a Symbiosis Center for India-Australia Studies, so that not just the Indian students would know more about Australian universities, but even the Australian students will get to know more about Indian universities and more specifically about Symbiosis. We have a lot of such programs with other universities, primarily in Europe, and therefore we established a Symbiosis Center for European Studies. And we realized that when we institutionalize this collaboration with several universities into a center, that's when, focused areas of work was getting done. The European Legal Studies program, and soon we will launch the European Studies program. So therefore, we see that with these kind of synergies between Australian universities and ours, we may even think of starting a few courses in Indigenous Studies of Australia in our School of Liberal Arts. So I see a lot of opportunities coming our way, as well as, opportunities for Australian universities to have a footprint here in India. With Deakin, our focus has been on women entrepreneurship. So we have a Symbiosis Center for Entrepreneurship and Innovation, which is a technology business incubator supported by the Government of India. And one wing of that is the Women Entrepreneurship Wing. And I'm very happy that Deakin is kind of hand-holding us, and we're doing a lot of work in these villages surrounding our university campus for women empowerment. So there can be several such opportunities that will come when a center gets established. And I can see the future of this center developing into very strong relationships, not just between universities, but between India and Australia. We all know that we would otherwise just fight with Australia on the cricket field, but now we see bilateral friendships happening where our prime ministers and the Minister of Trade from both sides have signed agreements for deepening relationships in various areas, of course trade and business, but more importantly education as well. And therefore, in the backdrop of the way governments have been talking to each other, the establishment of this center, I believe, is one important milestone, not just in the history of our university, but I would say in the history of India-Australia relationships. So once this center gets formally established today, we will definitely send a note to the Honorable Mr. Piyush Goyal, our Minister for Commerce, and of course to the Prime Minister's office as well as the Ministry of Education, so that they also notice that such a center has been established. So with these few words, I welcome all of you for a wonderful discussion of this, and of course the formal launch of this center. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Vidya, for sharing your vision. I'm now going to request Mr. Truswell and Dr. Vidya to officially inaugurate the center. We had to do this virtually, but of course, I think by next year, we would expect all of you all and invite you to come personally. By this time, the center would be also, we'll be doing a lot of activities. One of our partners, as Dr. Vidya has already mentioned, we do have a lot of partnerships with Australia. And one of our partners, the University of Adelaide, has sent in a short video to give their best wishes. So I request this video to be played.
Hello everyone. On behalf of the University of Adelaide staff and student body, I would like to offer my best regards and congratulations to Symbiosis International for staging this 6th annual conference on internationalisation of higher education. I would especially like to express my sincere thanks to the Chancellor, Dr. S.B. Majumdar, Dr. Vijaya Verakar, Pro-Chancellor, and Dr. Rajani Gupta, Vice-Chancellor, for their commitment to this initiative. This year's theme, Interregional Cooperation for Effective Internationalisation of Higher Education, resonates for a number of reasons, but particularly in relation to the launch of the Symbiosis Centre for India-Australia Studies. The Centre's launch is a significant milestone. At the institution level, it will help Indian and Australian universities forge closer and stronger bonds through collaborative research, joint study programs, and other activities. At the University of Adelaide, we greatly value our global partnerships and the opportunities this presents to foster stronger ties with our partners in India is something we're incredibly excited about. But the benefits stretch far beyond our respective campuses. Our relationships also strengthen the bonds between our nations, our people. They add an already rich cultural exchange spanning all areas of society, an exchange that has been happening for many, many years, and that, as our government's recently announced free trade agreement illustrates, will continue to grow for many years to come. We look forward to contributing to that growth by partnering with Symbiosis, and I have no doubt that we will achieve great things together. I will say goodbye now and leave you to enjoy the upcoming panel discussion chaired by Mr. Peter Truswell, the Australian Consul General based in Mumbai. Again, please accept our warmest congratulations on the opening of the Symbiosis Centre for India-Australia Studies. We wish you every success for the remainder of the conference and hope to have an opportunity to meet with you again in person soon. Thank you.
We do cherish this kind gesture. Mr. Peter Truswell, the keynote speaker for today, is a career officer with the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, popularly known as DFAT, and was most recently the Deputy Head of Mission, Australian Embassy, Kabul. He has previously served overseas in Seoul and Australian Permanent Mission, United Nations, Geneva. In Canberra, he has served in recent director roles in DFAT with a focus on South Asia and consular operations, and previously served in the Department of the Prime Minister and the Cabinet. Request you, sir, to kindly deliver the keynote address.
Yeah, thank you so much, Swati. I hope you can hear me clearly.
We can, thank you.
Yeah, and my apologies, I don't have the right background. I couldn't get the technology to work. Look, thank you so much, Swati, for that kind introduction and the warm welcome. Before I begin my address, I'd like to convey my congratulations to Dr. Vijaya, to her team, to you, Swati, for that very impressive virtual launch of the Symbiosis Centre for India-Australia Studies. I was impressed by the way we could draw the curtains virtually. This has been a keenly awaited announcement, I must say, and it's been my great pleasure, and I know Monica Kennedy, my senior Austrade colleague's great pleasure, to be consulted closely as the centre was conceptualised and moved forward. And so it's wonderful to be here today to see it launched. And good afternoon today to the distinguished gathering of academics, educationalists and policy practitioners here today. I'm very pleased to be addressing this edition of the SIU AIU Conference on Internationalisation of Higher Education. It's great to see some familiar faces, some new faces on screen today. And this isn't the first time, of course, that I've done something like this with Symbiosis and with other colleagues. So it's great that we're having frequent interactions of this kind, and that says something about the depth of the educational engagement between Australia and India as partners. To begin with, I'd like to reflect on how noteworthy the theme for this conference, Interregional Cooperation for Effective Internationalisation of Higher Education, is in today's post-pandemic environment. I think in 2022, we are witnessing a very strong recovery in international student mobility and renewed interest in studying abroad. But the lack of opportunity to travel, which has been in the past so useful in creating international education synergies to date, and which has been curtailed, of course, by the pandemic, I think this has served as a reminder that our education systems don't work well in isolation, and that they will best thrive and will meet the benchmarks and objectives we aim to meet through closer and often in-person collaboration. Bringing together the diversity and differing strengths in our areas of expertise and better leveraging the talent that we possess in both directions, I think makes for better quality outcomes in education and better prepares our youth for a truly global jobs and cultural world, which we can see now and more so in the future. And I'd echo, of course, Dr. Vijaya's comment about how important it is to see our students moving in both directions, between India and Australia and India. Another aspect is multi-stakeholder coordination between governments and university partners. That's an effective tool in catalysing broader inter-regional cooperation. And there can be few better examples of this than the India-Australia relationship. There have been decades of cooperation between our student, university, alumni and diaspora networks. And these have set a robust foundation for the government-to-government cooperation we're witnessing in the present. As again, Dr. Vijaya said very, very clearly, and I agree with her comments. When looking through the conference schedule, I was pleased to see that an independent track has been dedicated to Australasia-India cooperation in higher education. You're probably well aware that Indian students make up the second largest cohort of international student enrolments in Australia. And we're keen to keep welcoming Indian students, academics, and researchers, and strengthening the ties between the youth of our countries and our educational institutions. Indeed, international education is one of Australia's great success stories. We've had over 3 million students educated in the past 20 years from international cohorts. And I believe we have some of the best universities in the world and a well-earned reputation for excellence in teaching and research. But equally, I and my colleagues, Monica and I'm sure other colleagues here today, are so impressed by India's higher education landscape. That truly is a testament to one of your great strengths, your young, highly skilled population, as well as the dedication and energy of institutions of the caliber of Symbiosis, a great partner. We're neighbours in the Indo-Pacific. Our countries face common challenges. They include things such as climate change, the emergence and impact of new technology, and as I'm sure we've been reminded in the last couple of months, the changing, and often difficult geopolitical dynamics, which have a broader impact, of course. All of these make us natural partners in knowledge creation, innovation, and research. And we've seen this, with over 9,000 joint research publications between Australia and India since 2017, hundreds of institutional linkages, and many other activities such as policy exchanges and the transnational education architecture that we've helped establish under the comprehensive strategic partnership that exists at a higher political level between our two countries. But we shouldn't rest on our laurels. There's much more we can do. As a world-class education provider, Australia is well placed to partner with India across secondary, university and vocational sectors. In the higher education area, we're very keen to work with Indian universities and education boards in internationalising qualification frameworks, something that Dr. Vijay mentioned just now, building holistic curriculum, delivering skills training, and setting up best practices in research. And in this vein, I think India's new national education policy, the NEP, represents a strong opportunity for Australia and India to strengthen partnerships that truly reflect our shared values and will be critical to progressing the many mutual interests I've mentioned before. The Australian government has recently doubled down on its commitment to Indian students and the broader Australia-India education ecosystem. We recently announced what we call Maitri scholarships. These aim to support high-achieving Indian students to enable them to study at Australian universities. We have new, what we call Maitri grants and fellowships to build links between our future leaders and to collaborate on strategic research. And as mentioned before, the Australia-India Economic Cooperation and Trade Agreement, termed AI-ECTA, which is effectively an interim free trade agreement, and in fact the first free trade agreement that India has agreed with a developed country in a decade, so quite significant. That was signed only 2 weeks ago. And importantly, it delivers post-study work rights in Australia for Indian students, a mutual recognition framework for educational qualifications, and access for young Indians to participate in working holiday programs in Australia. All mechanisms to help, I think, the youth of our countries get to know each other and get to understand the two nations. So let me conclude by saying, look, with the many new initiatives, with the interest from multiple stakeholders to partner in education, research, skills and training, and against the backdrop of India's new education policy, it's so important to have dedicated centres such as this one, which was established only a few moments ago, that facilitate the growth of this relationship. Symbiosis International University has strong existing partnerships with many universities. We just saw one from South Australia, but there are many more, of course. The Symbiosis Centre for India-Australia Studies is a great step forward in institutionalising collaborative ventures between our universities, researchers and students. And I know for sure that the centre will quickly come alive with cross-learning opportunities, student exchanges, joint research, PhD programs, networking opportunities, and industry academia linkages as expected by the leadership of the Symbiosis University. And under the visionary, let me say, the visionary guidance of Pro Vice Chancellor Vidya, and also Swati, who just spoke to you before. Our High Commission in New Delhi, our network of Consulate General across the country, our Austrade colleagues will definitely be supporting the Centre's endeavours and will, as Vijay mentioned earlier, we will make sure that we communicate its objectives, its importance to our government, to our educational institutions and to many others. So look, let me conclude here for now. And I look forward very much to hearing perspectives from the panel session chair and speakers, all of whom I know are experts in their fields. Thank you so much for this opportunity to make a few remarks.
Thank you so much for your valuable insights. And we really appreciate the support, guidance, and the mentorship, and also look forward in future. At this point, I would also like to take the opportunity from all of us to wish all of you a happy Easter Sunday, which is tomorrow, to all of you and all your loved ones. We now move on to track 5. And here we are going to hear perspectives from Australia, New Zealand, and India. The chair for this session is Ms. Bridget Freeman. She's a senior researcher with the University of Melbourne. Her academic areas of specialization include international comparative research on higher education policy and systems, internationalization, governance, institutional policy, and delegation. She's currently researching the impact of COVID-19 on higher education systems, practices, and has served as a consultant to the Australian and international organizations, including UNESCO, and has extensive publications to her credit. A visiting scholar at the Center for Studies in Higher Education at UC Berkeley and American Council of Education in Washington, D.C. Currently, she's a visiting scholar at the University of Gießen in Germany. Thank you, Bridget, over to you now.
Thank you very much, Swati, and to Symbiosis for inviting me to participate in the launch of your centre. The Australia-India Institute at the University of Melbourne warmly welcomes the launch of the Symbiosis Centre for India-Australia Studies and looks forward to the centre playing a thought leadership role in promoting interregional cooperation. This Track 5 panel discusses various ways in which dialogue for interregional cooperation can be fostered, particularly cooperation involving Australasia and India. After my brief introduction and presentation, there are 3 further speakers. Firstly, Professor V. Ramgopal Rao, Professor in Electrical Engineering and the immediate past director of IIT Delhi. Professor Rao is an educator, researcher, innovator, entrepreneur, and academic leader. We're then joined by Ms. Ravneet Pahar. Ms. Pahar is Vice President, Global Alliances and CEO, South Asia with Deakin University, Australia. She is also President of the Australia-India Business Council in Victoria. The third and final speaker after me for this track is Dr. Elizabeth Rose. Dr. Rose is Research Chair Professor in Business Policy and Strategy at the Indian Institute of Management. After the speakers, we'll be taking some questions, so please feel free to put some questions into the chat box. Before proceeding to the other speakers, I'll briefly introduce today my thoughts on fostering interregional cooperation through diverse international research collaborations and innovative cross-border internships. As we're aware, in recent years, the Australia-India bilateral relationship has greatly matured, reflecting some shared geopolitical and economic drivers. Our governments have elevated the Australia-India relationship to a comprehensive strategic partnership and very recently signed the Australia-India Comprehensive Economic Cooperation Agreement, or AICECA. This relationship is grounded in commitments to defence cooperation, trade in strategic exports and imports, as well as aspirations regarding increased investment. There's also a richness of our education and research cooperations. This education relationship supports this broader agenda, such that education and research aligned with defence, trade and investment objectives have special resonance. For example, cybersecurity, critical minerals, agriculture, and pharmaceuticals. However, in addition to these mutually agreed strategic priorities, Universities Australia research from 2020 attests to the rich and growing connections between Australian universities and Indian higher education institutions. And these connections are around multiple science, technology, engineering and maths, or STEM, and humanities, arts and social sciences, or HAS, disciplines. My analysis from 2017 of the Universities Australia data suggests that most Australia-India memorandums of understanding traverse both STEM, social science and humanities disciplines. This includes engineering and technology, information and computing sciences, medical health and biological sciences in STEM, in humanities, culture and creative arts, and in social sciences, most of these connections or agreements tend to be in management and law. Our aspirations for interregional cooperation must accommodate the richness of our knowledge systems and shared endeavours. Ambitious agendas for increased global and interregional cooperation around education and research were highlighted in the Government of India's National Education Policy 2020. The NEP, which Mr. Truswell alluded to, prioritises partnerships with high-ranked foreign institutions addressing global challenges. Cooperation between elite higher education institutions is very well illustrated by Australia-India joint PhD academies, most recently including India's Academy of Scientific and Innovative Research and the University of Western Australia. However, in addition to these joint PhD academies, Australia-India education-based cooperation includes collaborations with India's Tier 2 and Tier 3 specialist research institutions, comprehensive universities, and other higher education institutions. Collaborations are also emerging through cross-border education industry partnerships, for example, internships, or in Australia, we refer to work integrated learning, or WIL. Some of my research has focused on international research collaborations involving Australia and India. Studies on global science and internationalisation have long highlighted the role of these international research collaborations in furthering interregional cooperation. My research with Dr. Andrew Ducha from the Australia-India Institute has identified, within the context of the Australia-India relationship, 7 good practices. This includes, firstly, physical mobility, particularly in the early stages of projects. Then harnessing new communications technologies, which we've had much practice of in the last few years, undertaking a spectrum of research collaboration and teaching elements, a relationship built over time for the long term, a relationship built on mutual interests and complementary capabilities, understanding the diversity of India, and finally, visibility and consolidation of Australia's research strengths and focus on India. Aspiring to embed these good practices would accelerate our interregional cooperation ambitions. This will require attention to associated enablers, including research visa processing, support for physical and online people-to-people connections, such as the recently announced Maitri scholarships and fellowships, improved literacies about our respective countries, and increased recognition of the role of HAS, or humanities research in particular. It will also require the commitment of governments and institutions to academic freedom. I'd also like to briefly talk about Australia into India internships or work integrated learning. In terms of education industry partnerships, my research with Dr. Karen Barker, which will be published shortly, has identified cross-border internship models involving industry, institutions and students in rich learning partnerships, providing opportunities for interregional cooperation for skills or VET and higher education students is part of a forward-looking strategy for improving our bilateral relations involving industry going forward. The models developed through our research have the capacity to accommodate peer engagement through extracurricular activities such as competitions, hackathons and industry certification, as well as participation in online, onshore and offshore internships with Indian host organisations. These models represent an important pivot to India-facing mobility for students of the Australian education system, and this would introduce some reciprocity into the flow of students and learning from Australia to India, which is vitally important, while at the same time strengthening education industry partnerships across and within our nation's borders. And just finally, in terms of learnings from the COVID-19 pandemic, interregional cooperation can also benefit from sharing our learnings as we recover from the COVID-19 pandemic. The myriad ways in which higher education systems and institutions responded to and recovering from disruptions over these last 2 years. This is consistent with the joint statement on a comprehensive strategic partnership between the Republic of India and Australia. This joint agreement resolved to boost collaboration on science, technology and research to support national COVID-19 responses. Our Higher Education in Emergencies group, involving Dr. Ian Teo in Australia, Professor Peter Lei in Chile and Professor Dong Kim in Japan, has been analysing high-level recovery strategies in terms of geopolitics and jurisdictional contexts and shifts in system policy and regulation. We've developed a diagnostic lens to analyse these system-level domains, as well as domains focused on the institutional level. This includes financing, infrastructure, teaching and learning, research, pathways, governance and leadership, and human resources. There's much to learn from cooperating across our borders to explore these challenges in these critical system and institutional level domains to better prepare for other looming emergencies, such as climate change. Just in closing, we welcome the rich range of mutually beneficial opportunities for sustained interregional cooperation and look forward to working with Symbiosis further. Thank you very much. I'm just going to hand over now to Professor Rao, who will speak with us. Professor Rao.
Thank you, Ms. Freeman. I'm very happy to be here with all of you. I have made a short presentation. I will share my slides and talk about that. So this is based on my experience of starting the UKIDOR, University of Queensland IIT Delhi Academy, which is now doing very well. And I just wanted to give a brief perspective. I mean, I'm also speaking maybe mostly on behalf of IIT system. There are 23 IITs, and that is what I'm well aware of. So now if you look at the Indian higher education and specifically where the IITs are headed, in the next, let's say 10 years, of course, we need to increase our enrollment, the gross enrollment ratio in our higher educational institutions. Currently, it's at 26%. It needs to go up to 50% as per the NEP. And IITs, for example, at IIT Delhi, we have doubled our intake, in the last 7 years. And now we are like something like 11,500 students at IIT Delhi. And that number used to be, around 5,000 for a very, very long time. So we are all increasing the intake in our institutions. And another major mandate now that is being put forth by the government of India is that one wants to see at least 20 Indian institutions among the top 100 in the world, and the institutions of eminence scheme, which has been launched by government of India about 3.5 years ago. IIT Delhi is one of those institutions. So I think all these schemes are to take some of our institutions to the top 20 among the 100. Or in the 100 kind of rankings. And if you look at the research that is happening, India is a leading country. India is ranked 3rd in the world when it comes to knowledge generation, looking at the publications and all of that. And we are growing at 14% when it comes to the research output. But the biggest concern is that we are not doing enough, or we are not doing well on the innovation front. We are ranked 46th in the world when it comes to innovation. And even when it comes to protection of IP, we are ranked 35th in the world. So this is one of the concerns that we have, and that needs to change soon. Another major challenge for higher educational institutions, particularly institutions like IITs, is that we are not connected well enough with the societal problems. While we tend to do research, but much of this research doesn't really have doesn't have much of a relevance to the country's problems. Most of the research is targeted towards publications in good journals and all that, which is what we should be doing. There is nothing wrong in that. But I think one of the things now government also wants is that higher educational institutions solve the societal problems, apply this knowledge that we generate to also improve the quality of life of a common man. Another thing which government is also very aggressively pushing is an inclusive education system that gives equal opportunities to socially backward communities. And we have been addressing it in a variety of ways, including the most recent one, which is for economically weaker sections. We have all now reserved 10% of seats in our institutions. And another thing is also about increased investments in higher education by industries. There are again multiple avenues for industries to do so. Government is also in a way providing multiplier grants, and even the Prime Minister's fellowship scheme for PhD students is also to encourage industries to support PhD students. So this is also something that's happening. And another thing which government also wants us to do is develop India as an educational hub for international students. And there are multiple initiatives like Study in India program, Institutions of Eminence program. So these are the changes that you would expect in the next few years. And in fact, the NEP, the New Education Policy, also talks about something similar. And giving a push to innovation is, of course, very important right now. The Startup India, Stand Up India kind of initiatives of Government of India now are also giving a lot of encouragement to startups on our campuses. Having said that, IIT Delhi, my experience as head of the institute for 6 years at IIT Delhi. So during my time, for the first time ever, we signed 2 agreements for joint PhD programs, one with the National Chao Tung University in Taiwan, and other notably with the University of Queensland in Australia. And the University of Queensland Australia program is really scaling up very well. This year, we should be, in fact, in the next 3 months, we should hit that century. There will be 100 PhD students who are jointly supervised by faculty at IIT Delhi and the University of Queensland. And we also now have, our target is to reach at least 1/3 of these students to be supported by industries. And we have a CEO who is very aggressively working on that. And we already have many major corporates supporting students between India and Australia to the joint PhD program. This is in a way a success story, by any standards. In a matter of 2.5 years, reaching 100 student mark as joint PhD students is a pretty steep rise that way, without compromising on the quality. I should also tell you one thing which it has done for IIT Delhi is many of these students who are joining the joint PhD program otherwise may not have joined IIT Delhi. So many of these were in a way prepared to go to US, and these are the students we have been able to attract into the system, and that way we are able to keep them in the system. So that is one good thing which I believe has happened because of the Queensland joining hands with IIT Delhi. At IIT Delhi, we also have started an international PhD program, fellowship program, and we have 500 PhD fellowships for international scholars. We have filled up about 100 of them, and we are still looking for 400 more PhD students. And some of the students coming from the neighboring countries, we're also in a way bringing them to the joint PhD program between IIT Delhi and University of Queensland. We have also, of course, signed a large number of MOUs and all that. So a lot of things are happening on that front too. The potential for India and Australasia program, at least in the context of IITs, IITs need to improve the quality of graduate programs. And that's one thing where the joint programs will definitely be helpful. And like I mentioned, the UKIDAR program, we have been able to attract students who otherwise wouldn't have come to IIT Delhi for doing PhD. So I think that is where the joint PhD programs, in my opinion, have been pretty useful for us. And IITs are also looking for, all IITs, I can tell you, are looking for joint PhD programs. So that's a great opportunity now, because IIT Bombay has done it with Monash University, IIT Delhi with Queensland University. So these two have been pretty successful. And now every IIT wants to do something similar. I think more Australian universities, joining hands with more IITs in the country and doing such joint programs, I think, in my opinion, will be a way to go. And PhD programs support we need to always find, because the PhD students don't pay any major fee, and but they can generate knowledge which can help boost the innovation ecosystem. So for that, connecting these joint PhD programs with the startups is also very important. That's something that we have done. So therefore, we have been very actively and aggressively looking for industry sponsorship of these joint PhD students, and also working on societal problems, so that when they find a solution, we can help them start a company, and the equity that UKIDAR will hold, can get them some revenues back over a period of time. And it is also pretty affordable to do PhD in India. So joint PhD programs help in a way, because it costs on an average, less than US dollars 10,000 per year per PhD student in IITs. And the same student in any other university, would have been much more expensive. And so joining hands with Indian universities, you can also scale up the PhD programs much more aggressively. That's one advantage. And also one thing I see missing right now is the semester exchange programs for undergraduate students. I mean, at IIT Delhi, it would have gone very well if any Australian university came forward and said, our students will come to you and your students can come to us. And we have a very competitive undergraduate program in all IITs. I think that is also the place where a semester exchange would have been useful. And I think for all of these, US is the main competitor. The best Indian students still want to go to US. I think that is something that has been happening for decades. But I think that is where creating networking opportunities, mobility for faculty, I think if we bring in the faculty into these collaborations, I think, and also build more institutional linkages, I think that way we can now orient many of these students who otherwise would have gone to US to come and join us. I think that is pretty important. Otherwise, just expecting that the students will come to Australia and not go to US is not going to happen unless we involve the faculty and institutions in the process, like what we have done in the case of University of Queensland IIT Delhi program. And India is also a large and diverse country, and joining hands with IITs, other good institutions in the country, in my opinion, is the best way to ensure the quality graduates to join these programs, because IITs at all levels, whether it is undergraduate or postgraduate, we have developed excellent selection processes. All these exams are pretty well organized and well conducted. I think using such avenues to attract good quality students into these programs is also pretty important. The research and development, coupled with relevance of research to both the countries, and startups to deliver the results to the society, I think that is one way we can create win-win collaborations for between our countries, and IITs now have a very thriving startup ecosystem, and we can actually make use of that. And India offers the scale for skills and technologies available in Australia, New Zealand kind of countries, and that's also an opportunity to connect our startups through some of these processes. The question always is who will fund these programs. I think that is where our UKIDAR initiative has shown that we can of course receive funds from government, we can receive funds from industry, which is happening more and more, and also the philanthropy. I think at some point we need to target all of these sources to support and scale up these joint PhD programs. This is my last slide. I think I would like to see more semester exchange programs with IITs and other institutions at the undergraduate level, joint degree programs with top Indian institutes with well-defined problem statements. I would like to see more of them. And I think Australia is missing out on PhDs from India or the postdocs from India. Many of them today go to Japan, Germany, other countries because they have these national fellowships, the postdoctoral programs, whether it is Humboldt fellowships or JSPS fellowships. I think Australia needs to start a postdoctoral program and attract a lot of high quality PhDs into some of these national postdoctoral program. I think that will also build more bridges between our institutions, and integrating the startup ecosystem in both the countries is going to be very useful. Involvement of, as I mentioned, corporates, philanthropists, and government is the key, and a grand challenger kind of an approach for research collaborations, because India has enough problems and so does Australia. I think identifying grand challenges and putting these teams to provide or develop solutions to these challenges faced in all these countries, I think that's a good approach to link our startups to the entire scheme. And IITs currently are looking at expansion, excellence, and equity as key drivers. Internationalization is on the agenda of all the IITs now. We're all aggressively looking for international partners. And I would think a great opportunity for higher educational institutions in India and Australasia to come together as part of this initiative. So thank you very much for giving me this opportunity.
Thank you very much, Professor Rao, for sharing your insights about some of the ways in which Australia and India interregional cooperation can be enhanced. I'd like to hand over to the next speaker, Ms. Ravneet Paha from Deakin University. Ravneet.
Thank you very much, Bridget, and a very good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. A very warm welcome to this wonderful session. I'd like to place a special thanks to Dr. Vidya and her team. Thank you, Swati and others. It has been a pleasure to be associated with Symbiosis for a very long time, and I have no doubt that with the future looking so bright, we will have a much stronger partnership with Symbiosis. It was wonderful to be a part of the launch of the center, so congratulations, Peter and the team. I think this was long coming. Symbiosis has always been a friend to Australia, but I think having an Australia-India center based out of Symbiosis is definitely going to help the Australian-Indian partnership. Australia-India education corridor is interesting. Education is the backbone to our relationship for Australia, which has been mentioned very specifically in the Australia-India economic strategy and the reverse of it. Australasian region now is a very, very strong powerhouse. And I think vast majority of students have studied in Australia in recent years and have come back to the Indian shores to contribute back to the Indian economy. If statistics are any proof, before COVID-19, there were close to 100,000 Indian students in Australia, and the Indian diaspora in the country has now crossed 750,000. The pandemic has only served to prove our fragility and our interconnectedness. Urgent actions taken collectively is needed to change course and reimagine our futures. This act of reimagining, in my mind, means working together to create futures that are shared and interdependent, and to look at the world problems, which has been mentioned before. I think it's really important for organizations, institutions, and governments to come together to really think about the world problems and a way and a measure to resolve them. The internationalization of higher education has evolved the education sector into globally an interconnected knowledge-based economy. Key international partnerships with academia and knowledge exchanges with collaborators are crucial to building the regional and interregional cooperation for peace and prosperity. I think a very important point that my previous speaker mentioned was engagement in research. Over the past decade, we've seen the growth in a number of university arrangements between Australia and India. I come from Deakin University. Deakin University was the first university to set up an office in India in the year 1994. We are about to celebrate our 30 years of engagement with India. And in this process, we have been able to form some very productive partnerships with Indian institutions for education, research, training, and interesting projects. We have about 150 to 180 PhD students in India at any one point of time, and we have a joint center of excellence based out of IIT Madras and IIT Hyderabad across looking at smart manufacturing and lightweighting, where the projects that we take are supported by Indian industry. We also have a joint center with TERI, where we have close to 50 PhD students at any one point of time. And this is looking at smart agriculture. And we have various other key partnerships in the area of research and engagement. And I totally agree that the way to go forward is to really put an effort from both institutions to create a joint corridor by way of joint doctoral programs in conducting research and outcomes, creating an ecosystem, and thereby looking at societal benefits. This has helped in fostering the Australia-India education corridor and capacity and research capital through these very crucial collaboration. I think it is really important to say that if we are focusing on this corridor, if we are focusing on the Australia-India relationship, the Australia-India Economic Strategy 2035 highlights the key aspects of cooperation, right from looking at climate change to manufacturing, to critical technologies, critical minerals, and so forth. I think the recently signed Australia-India pre-harvest agreement will facilitate extending the various paths of collaboration between the two countries. The National Education Policy 2020 also provides a framework for Australian institutions to work much more closely with Indian institutions, not just for research, but also for education programs. And I think Symbiosis Institution is a leader in its own right in looking at intercollaboration between institutions. And I am very, very happy to say that it is going to be a pleasure to be able to launch a center hub of Deakin University in Symbiosis in the near future. Building on the education trade and recently concluded Australia-India ECTA, I think the Maitri scholarships, which were mentioned before by Peter Truswell and my other colleagues, and I think various other initiatives of the government is going to go a long way in helping not just the economic, but also the academic and the cultural ties between our two countries. How regional cooperation has risen in economic, educational, and cultural dimensions has convincingly indicated that new models of higher education governance are now emerging in India, marked by evolving traits of regulatory regionalism. We need to be mindful of some of the implications for the future, given the dynamic strategic situation in the Indo-Pacific for the future of Australasia and India dialogue. The Australasia-India dialogue is growing to become more of a partnership. How can this be fostered further? India is growing economically and will soon be more confident a region, both in pursuing its own interest as well as growing its partnership with Australasia and tackling the international agenda. I think if you look at what India has done in the last 2 years, you will realize that India has not only just looked how to support its own citizens, it has also looked how to be a very active player in the region, whether across healthcare, whether across education, whether across working in innovation. Interregional cooperation should not look to complement and not replace strategic bilateral relations amongst nations, especially amongst India and Australasia, more in the case with Australia. Building and fostering strong cooperation across areas in economic, trade, investment, and people-to-people ties will go a long way between the Australia-India relationship. In my role as the Australia-India Business Council President for Victoria, in the last 3 months, I've seen a whole lot of interest from Indian companies looking at Australia and Australian companies looking at India, whether we are looking at agriculture or whether we are looking at dairy or we are looking at the FMCG. I think this is itself a testament of the cooperation between the two countries. More broadly, the Indian region is a region that promises many exciting economic opportunities for Australia and Australasia in the broader scope of interregional cooperation. And I think the Comprehensive Strategic Partnership 2020 as well, between Australia and India, education, trade corridor, and people-to-people ties, are all these bilateral aspects will enhance the cooperation. I think in the backdrop of the national education policy, which I know Vidya has been a very active part of, it does define more cooperation. It does define student mobility. I would encourage a lot of the Australian institutions to closely look at a win-win situation where Australian students can come and spend time in India in this growing economy, and Indian students can spend time in Australia. I think semester abroad, which was mentioned recently by my previous speaker, is a very, very important part of cooperation. I also think that focusing on internationalization of curriculum between the two institutions is also a very important part of our cooperation. The new education contract that we form in a post-pandemic era, my dear friends, must unite us around collective endeavors and provide the knowledge and innovation needed to shape a sustainable and a peaceful future, all anchored according to the social, economic, and our environmental agendas. Thank you very much for having me part of this panel. I think it's a very, very strong panel between the Australia-India relationship, and with my colleagues from University of Melbourne and others, it's been a pleasure to be here. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ms. Paha, and Deakin University's long-standing relationship with India is renowned in Australia, and we're very pleased to have had your contribution at this panel. Thank you very much. We now move to the final speaker for this track, Dr. Elizabeth Rose. I will hand over to you.
Thank you, Bridget. Namaskar and kia ora. I'm from the other part of Australasia. So basically, first of all, congratulations to Symbiosis. It's on the launch of the center. It's lovely to see some familiar faces after quite a long time. And I'm very, very happy and looking forward to seeing this grow. I'm a professor at Indian Institute of Management, Udaipur, but I'm speaking to you from New Zealand, which is where I'm currently living. So I'm representing New Zealand for the moment. And as I was thinking about what to say, I've been aware for a very long time. I had been teaching outside. I'd been working outside of New Zealand for 4 years prior to joining AIU. But I have a lot of experience with New Zealand universities, and India is my happy place. So I do think that there are important linkages to be had. And it struck me for a very long time that New Zealand simply doesn't pay enough attention to India, whether it's in industry, whether it's in education. It's just, New Zealand doesn't think enough about India. We're way, way behind Australia in this regard. And I was trying to think of why. And I'd actually been trying to think of this for a long time, but decided to do my research thing and look up some data for once. And it's sort of understandable. You know, generally speaking, New Zealand's attention is elsewhere. If you look at trade, China, Australia, the EU, and the US account for 61% of New Zealand's total trade, and about the same proportion of the all-important total exports, because New Zealand is a very export-driven market. India actually only stands in 11th place in terms of total trade, eighth place for exports, representing 1.6% of New Zealand's total trade and only 12% of the trade that exists between New Zealand and China. So, you know, it's just New Zealand's attention is not on India. Over recent decades, New Zealand is focused in a business sense very, very much on China. which is actually quite a good fit with respect to some of New Zealand's key industries that provide sources of foreign exchange earning. Dairy, we do meat, we do wood, raw timber usually, we do tourism, and we do education. And so China has been a logical partner. But I think New Zealand has probably made a strategic decision I wouldn't have recommended, not that they asked me, in terms of focusing very heavily in one direction rather than taking a more probably useful portfolio approach. But there's another important difference with respect to New Zealand and Australia, and that has to do with size. In terms of population and especially economy, Australia is much more important to New Zealand, and always will be, than New Zealand is to Australia. We're kind of the little sister, even though we do refer to Australia as the West Island. Sorry, guys. And so, it's just, New Zealand is much more tied. We sort of tag along Australia to a degree, although we haven't been tagging along enough in terms of focus on India, particularly with respect to education. And in terms of education, New Zealand very much seems to be in catch-up mode with respect to the Indian market for international students. This became very, very clear to me when I took up the role of Associate Dean International for the University of Otago's Business School in 2014, back when I was teaching in the same place where I lived. And I was shocked, I was amazed. And the thing is, international education is a very, very big deal for New Zealand. Pre-COVID in 2019, international student fees amounted to in excess of $1 billion New Zealand dollars, which is way more rupees than I can count. In 2019, there were over 13,000 Indian passport students in tertiary education in New Zealand, but only 2,800 of them were at universities. And these numbers represent about 15% of all international students during tertiary study in New Zealand, and only 10% of those at universities. And I think this is a massive missed opportunity for New Zealand and for Indian students who are looking to study overseas, and was actually kind of a nice place. Now, I do understand, I get it, that New Zealand is not the first choice for Indian students. It's not the United States, it's not the UK, it's not Australia. There's the issue of reputation, or the perceived value of the degree if students want to come back to India. There's the potential for employment, which frankly is not nearly as good in New Zealand as it is in Australia. And there's distance. There are no direct flights from New Zealand to India. Trust me on this one, I know. And that just makes it a step farther that is a barrier, I think. And then to make things more complicated, at least in terms of business schools, the postgraduate system in the two countries are different enough to make articulation agreements a little bit difficult and awkward. I know, I've tried these. So students need to be particularly interested and keen on New Zealand as a destination. And many of the Indian students coming to New Zealand seem to be focusing more on residence than on academic education. Sorry, I'm a research nerd. I'd rather see people focusing on academic education. I'm not saying that this isn't a legitimate choice, but I think it's a loss for New Zealand universities. There are not as yet very many truly effective academic links between India and New Zealand in terms of research-based collaboration, which I think is really, really important. There is a fairly recent agreement between IIT Delhi and the 8 universities in New Zealand, creating a New Zealand research center at IIT Delhi. I don't know how that is played out in practice, but I bet Professor Rao knows quite a lot about this. It was signed in 2020, and things have obviously been a little messy since then. And in fact, New Zealand's borders are still pretty much closed to the rest of the world for the next few months. But I think this is really important because in my experience, really valuable and productive research links tend to be driven by individual relationships. That's how they get started. It's pretty hard to tell academics what they should be working on. It's pretty hard to tell academics anything. But I think that useful collaborations are based on individual people working together, and it builds up from there. And not many New Zealand academics, at least in my broad area of business, and I've taught at 3 New Zealand universities, have a lot of familiarity with the Indian context, which I personally think offers up endless fascinating research questions. And I think that having more Indian students, especially at postgrad level, would, whether it's students studying in New Zealand or joint supervision relationships or joint degree relationships, that would allow a lot more New Zealand academics to gain exposure to India as a research context through informal interaction, and especially research collaboration, research supervision that leads to collaboration. Thinking about it, my own research trajectory has been influenced very, very strongly by my experiences of supervising students. Things I'm now known for, such as research on international entrepreneurship, innovation, and knowledge, and emerging markets, those all were started, those were sparked by supervising students. And in fact, I'm now about to start handling, serving as an editor for an FD 50 journal in international entrepreneurship. And that's, again, it's based on, that was sparked by a student that I was supervising. Postgrad students, especially doctoral students, can also facilitate linkages with Indian universities and institutes that are kind of difficult that can maybe difficult to start elsewhere. So fundamentally, I would really like to see New Zealand institutes of higher education engaging a lot more with India as a source for research collaboration and learning, rather than as a source of full fee paying students, which isn't even done very effectively to date. I think that both India and New Zealand are experiencing a real ramping up of expectations with respect to research and publication, which means that academics have common goals. In many fields, New Zealand and Indian academics have pretty complementary skills and capabilities, which means there's a lot of synergy that can produce better research. And top-level Indian institutions are already doing really excellent work on some issues that are extremely important to New Zealand's economic future, such as high-tech stuff that I don't understand very much, but again, Professor Rao will know about. But this is happening in India, and I think that not having access to this is a problem for New Zealand. Now, making this happen is going to require resources in terms of time, funding, coordination with government agencies, the facilitation of relationships. None of this is easy, I know, and the track record to date is not great, but I am absolutely confident that the potential benefits far outweigh the costs. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Rose, and presumably from beautiful Dunedin in New Zealand, where we have very fond memories.
Stewart Island, actually.
Stewart Island, even better. Thank you so much for your insights, particularly for raising the issue about the amount of attention our countries, New Zealand, Australia and India, in fact, pay to each other in many different levels of our different sectors, and also raising the issue about reciprocal exchanges and global pathways for international students, and the importance of different aspects of research collaboration and research supervision. Thank you very much, Dr. Rose. We're now going to turn to questions and answers. We have about 6 minutes. We have a question for Professor Rao from Dr. Kotija, who is the Dean of Engineering at Symbiosis. And Dr. Kotija asks whether with the joint PhD academies there is benefit in concentrating institution to institution programs with very many students. So one institution to another institution with, for example, 100 PhD students, as you've given in some of your examples, or whether there is benefit in one institution diversifying and connecting with many, for example. So Symbiosis University, as I understand it from the question in the chat box, has joint PhD arrangements with 14 universities. Professor Rao, would you like to comment on some of the benefits of either of these different models, please?
Yeah, I'm not sure how much I know about the other aspect of having multiple universities where you spread out your students. At least the advantages I see having fewer partners at IIT Delhi, for example. We consciously decided in each continent we will have one academic partner, and we will then engage with this partner and then develop deeper kind of collaborations. That is what we have been doing. For example, the University of Queensland thing, the way it worked was we formed this academy, the UKIDAR as we call it, University of Queensland IIT Delhi Research Academy. We appointed a CEO. The CEO, there is a budget for the CEO. So we have a full-fledged office right now, which manages the collaborations between the two universities. Both are large universities. At IIT Delhi, we have now close to 700 faculty members, and same is true at University of Queensland. UQ, being a more multidisciplinary university, is much larger. So I think we don't see a need for having multiple universities in one country. I think right now, the way we are also doing is we have tried to connect our faculty at the two places, and we are now writing joint proposals. We are approaching industries with these joint proposals, and all of that we could not have done if there are 10 universities we are partnering with. I think the deeper engagement between two large universities, I think probably has its own advantages, so our target is, in each country we would like to identify such collaborating universities and take things forward. But at some point, maybe one can try having more than one. So I don't know.
Thank you very much, Professor Rao. And if anybody else has another question in the chat box, then we'd certainly welcome that. We have one other question that concerns quality and benchmarking opportunities. The panel members have spoken about a range of collaborations in teaching and learning and in research and research training. I'm wondering whether you have a view about some benchmarking exercises that may have been undertaken with institutions in our different countries that have contributed to quality improvements.
I think if I may come in here, Bridget, I guess in the education and teaching space, both our accrediting systems have been talking to each other, the Australian and the Indian parts, and they've been looking at the NQF and the AQF to see how we marry the two systems so that there is equivalence and that there is a quality assurance across both sides. I think it will take some time for the results to be, put out, but I do think that the system in place is a robust one, and that institutions that are interested to look at joint programs between India and Australia can connect with the NQF and the AQF to see what quality assurance exercises can be undertaken. We've done that in the past, and that has been quite helpful to us.
Wonderful. Thank you, Ravneet. Professor Rao or Dr. Rose, did you have any other final comments that you'd like to make, either in response to those brief questions or in response to other speakers' presentations before we sum up in about 2 minutes' time?
I don't have any other comments.
Okay.
No,
all right.
just thank you, Bridget, for chairing this so well.
I would just like to say heartiest congratulations to Symbiosis, and Dr. Vidya, thank you so much for being such a friend to Australia, and I'm really looking forward to working with colleagues and friends at the Symbiosis University.
Yes, thank you very much, and certainly from me, thank you very much for the invitation to participate in this track and to connect with Symbiosis and the other speakers. Just in summing up, The speakers have emphasised the importance of interregional cooperation in terms of economic and other strategic agendas, and also highlighted the richness and varied ways in which cooperation has emerged that both align with and support these strategic high-level objectives to reflect our broader learning and research and indeed community and inclusivity agendas. And the speakers have emphasised the importance of coming together to address shared global problems, including both COVID-19 and climate change going forward. They've recommended the cooperation of Australia and New Zealand improve and be ramped up, with our countries looking to each other increasingly for joint corridors, as Ravneet termed it, covering a range of collaborations. This would include Indian students continuing to travel to or study with institutions in Australasia, including New Zealand, and importantly, reciprocity with this, so that students from Australian systems would travel to India for studies. And also importance of international research collaboration. Professor Rao highlighted where India's higher education system is headed, growth in international collaborations, particularly around joint PhDs, which at this point represents a key juncture of the collaborative trajectory. More needs to be done in terms of undergraduate semester exchanges, joint degrees, qualifications recognition, postdoctoral programs, and collaborative startups. It's been a wonderful session. Thank you so much. And thank you for joining us, thank you for welcoming us, and thank you for participating. Over to you, Swati.
Thank you so much, Bridget, for summing it up so beautifully. Thank you to the speakers. And I think, the practical aspects and insights that you've shared are going to really assist this center in, may I say, fostering cooperation, forging partnerships, and while still enhancing the domestic capability. So thank you so much.